Good evening and greetings to everyone. Our subject for this evening is in continuation of the moral issues of life and death would be specifically sins against human life. So if we can have the start of our video, uh, sins against human life. Uh, it has been mentioned in the opening prayer that we are being uh, attacked by a culture that is being that is now prevalent in our society. We call it the culture of death. Sins against human life is actually a commission of an act that proceeds from the claim that we own our own life. For instance, abortion, we think that we have control over the life of the baby in the womb. The use of stem cell, of the use of the human embryo, which we consider human life already, but still is being uh, exploited for many uses that entails destruction of many of the human embryos produced. Euthanasia, of course, is taking somebody else's life at supposedly for a reason that they wanted to help out the suffering, the ones who are suffering and would like to help them end their sufferings. That's why sometimes it's even called mercy killing. And suicide, of course, is proceeding from the assumption that it is your life, therefore you can take it anytime on your own. So these are all sins against human life. Abortion, producing human embryo for exploitation, using them, the use of stem cell, euthanasia, and suicide. So we'll go at this one by one. We start with abortion. Let's go to the next slide. Abortion. As you can see there, abortion is killing, is murder of a child inside the womb of a mother. And there are now a grave culture that is affecting the babies in the wombs of mother. And there's a Holocaust going on. This is what we call the abortion Holocaust. This kind of Holocaust is way over the Holocaust of the Jews during World War II, where 6 million Jews were killed. Now, if you look at the surveys made about how many abortions are committed every year, in the United States alone, at least 4,000 abortions are committed each day. That amounts to about 1,460,000 babies killed in a year. Worldwide, the number of abortions per day is approximately about 126,000. That's about 46 million a year. So the Holocaust of the Jews pales in comparison. The overwhelming majority of all abortions are done as a means of birth control because they didn't want the baby. Simple as that. No matter what stage the baby is in the womb of the mother. Only 1% are being performed because of rape or incest, 3% due to the mother's health problems, and 1% because of fetal abnormalities. 95% is just to have, not just to get rid of the unwanted baby. Okay? So this is the thing that should really be addressed by all of us because this is an ongoing Holocaust. Okay. So if we go to the next slide, the first thing that we need to understand, and everybody must believe that life begins from the moment of conception. When human life begins, it's not a theory, it's a scientific fact. Paragraph 2270 of the Catechism reads, human life must be respected and protected absolutely from the moment of conception, from the first moment of his existence. A human being must be recognized as having the rights of a person, among which is the inviolable right of every innocent being to life. Once the sperm unites with the egg, already there is a full genetic makeup of the human being. There is in that point in time already a complete and unique genetic code in the embryo. So the growth is just a matter of degree of development. And the scripture attests to that in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5. It reads, before I formed you in the womb, I know you. So before even you have been formed to look like a human, you have already been known by the Lord. And then in Isaiah chapter 49, verse 1, the scripture reads, the Lord called me from birth, from my mother's womb. He gave me my name. As soon as, from the very moment of conception, God has created a separate soul, and God has given that soul a name. Okay. Now, it's ironic that under the human law, this is not being recognized. It's just a blob of tissue and not a human being. Yet, the irony of it is when a crime is committed, when murder is committed against a pregnant woman, the offender will be prosecuted for double murder. The, that's really paradoxical because here the civil law would prosecute the offender for double murder whenever the woman is pregnant. But in many other things, the law has a very different treatment of it. Okay. So the embryo is a human being, and we are not to consider it as a mere blob of tissue. If we go to the next slide, it is provided in even the early writings of the apostles from the first century of the church. You shall not kill the human embryo by abortion. So if you read paragraph 2271, it says, since the first century of the church, since the first century, the church has affirmed the moral evil of every procured abortion. This teaching has not changed and remains unchangeable. Direct abortion, that is to say, abortion willed either as an end or a means, is gravely contrary to moral law. You shall not kill the embryo by abortion and shall not cause the newborn to perish. Abortion is killing a child of God. We are all children of God. Every child conceived in the womb of the mother is a child of God. Okay? And this teaching has been entrenched from the very first century of the church. If you look at the Didache, which is the writing of the apostles, uh, this has been very prevalently mentioned in all of these writings. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Who are responsible for abortion? Not just the one who had himself, her baby aborted, but everybody else that cooperated in an abortion, like the health workers, the accomplices, the acolytes, the doctors themselves, who assisted in abortion. If you read that paragraph 2272 of the Catechism, it says that formal cooperation in an abortion constitutes a grave offense. The church attaches the canonical penalty of excommunication to this crime against human life. A person who procures a completed abortion, anyone, all the acolytes, the health workers, all the accomplices, they incur excommunication latae sententiae, which means by the very commission of the offense, they are already excommunicated and subject to the conditions provided for by canon law. Right? So if you go to the next slide, let's understand why is abortion unlawful? It's unlawful because the law must protect life. Paragraph 2273. The inalienable rights of the person must be recognized and respected by civil society and the political authority. So that, and even in the Constitution, the protection of life is enshrined. It guarantees the protection of life. So the law must always protect life. These human rights depend neither on single individuals nor on parents, nor do they represent a concession made by society and the state. They belong to human nature and are inherent in the person by virtue of the creative act from which the person took his origin. Among such fundamental rights, one should mention in this regard every human being's right to life. So abortion is unlawful because all humans have the right to life and physical integrity. Abortion is unlawful because human life begins at conception. And so the Catechism at the end reads, from the moment of conception until death. So that is why abortion is unlawful. If you say that the law should not protect life, it is not an obligation of the legislators to protect life, then you are going against the very core of the Constitution of the United States, at least. Okay. So if you deny that right, you are in legal error. If you say that all humans not all humans have the right to life. Only the humans, only those that are wanted, only those that are going to be born normal, then that becomes a moral error. Okay. And then of course, it is unlawful because there is already life at the very conception of the baby. Right? So those are the reasons why it is unlawful. The law must protect life. All humans have the right to life, and human life begins at conception. Now, however, we have many in our society, especially in the culture of death that is prevalent in our society now. I would say probably much more than 50%. Okay. We have what we call the pro-choicers of different kinds. Let's go to the next slide. What are the kinds of pro-choicers? Okay. Firstly, those people who think that life should not be protected, that not all humans have the right to life, that life does not begin at conception. Okay. Now, there are also those that believe that that all humans have the right to life. They believe that they can still be pro-choicer, and they believe that life does not begin at conception, but they do not believe that life should be protected by law. Therefore, they say the law should have not, the legislators should never legislate on this matter. So those are pro-choicers that are on legal error because they are going against the guaranteed protection of life. And then there are those pro-choicers that believe that the law should protect life, but and that life begins at conception, but they don't believe that all humans have the right to life. So those are pro-choicers that are committing moral error because it is immoral to deny someone of their right. There are pro-choicers who believe that the law should protect life, that all humans have the right to life, but they do not believe. Yeah, now, a lot of them here falls into this category. They do not believe that life does begin at conception. Well, those pro-choicers, of course, are in factual or scientific error. So there are different, these are all the different kinds of pro-choicers that we are dealing with. Okay. All right. Let's go to the next slide. So we have established that as soon as the sperm is united with the egg, a child is already conceived, and that is already a human being. However, it is unfortunate that this embryo are being produced in different ways. They are produced in test tubes. They are produced in many other ways other than the conception of a woman in her womb of the child. So the catechism is very clear. No matter how this human embryo came about, it is immoral to produce these embryos for exploitation. Paragraph 2274 reads, since it must be treated from conception as a person, the embryo must be defended in its integrity, cared for, and healed as far as possible, like any other human being. Paragraph 2275 is very clear about this. It is immoral to produce human embryos intended for exploitation as disposable biological material. So let's try to understand what is this use of stem cell? What is a stem cell? I have here an article that I will be sharing with you about stem cell. First, the definition of stem cell is that it is a cell that is relatively unspecialized cell that when it divides can do two things: make another cell like itself, or make any of number of cells with more specialized functions. Now, these cells are like the stems of a plant. That's why you call them stem cells that spreads out in different directions as it grows. Now, is the Catholic Church opposed to all stem cell research? Not at all. Most stem cell research uses cells obtained from adult tissue that is not a human embryo. It is from the tissue, umbilical cord blood, and other sources that pose no moral problem. Okay? So the church is not opposed to all stem cell research. Useful stem cells have been found in bone marrow, blood, muscle, fat, nerves, and even in the pulp of a baby teeth. Some of these cells are already being used to treat people with a wide variety of diseases. So, why is the church opposed to stem cell research using the embryo? Obviously, because harvesting these stem cells kills the living human embryo. The church opposes the direct destruction of innocent human life for any purpose, including research. Now, haven't doctors, scientists, and commentators said that embryonic stem cell research will lead to the cure of many diseases? Is the church telling us to choose the lives of embryos over the lives of suffering patients? Firstly, the church is calling us to respect both the embryos and the lives of the suffering patients without discrimination. We must help those who are suffering, but we may not use a good end to justify an evil means. Some have made the claim that the embryonic stem cell research will lead to cure of many diseases, and it has been determined up to this point that this is largely speculative. Embryonic stem cells have never treated a human patient, and animal trials suggest that they are too genetically unstable and too likely to form little tumors to be used for treatment anytime soon. So, this kind of exaggerated promise has misled researchers and patient groups before, mostly obviously in the case of fetal tissue abortions, which a decade ago was said to have a promised miracle cures that has produced nothing of this of the kind. All right. So that is the reason why the church is against using stem cell for research because it entails the destruction of many of the embryos manufactured. Okay. All right. So we understand now that the church is very protective of the human embryo because it is considered as a child of God, even if they were produced in a test tube. Okay, so that is the morality of the use of human embryo. Next slide, please. Let's talk about euthanasia, mercy killing. First, let's read paragraph 2277, which is very clear about the church stand on euthanasia. It reads, whatever its motives and means, whatever your reason is, direct euthanasia consists in putting an end to the lives of handicapped, sick, or dying persons. It is morally unacceptable. Thus, an act or omission which of itself or by intention causes death in order to eliminate suffering constitutes a murder gravely contrary to the dignity of the human person and to the respect due to the living God, his creator. So, unequivocally, the church is saying that euthanasia is immoral, it is unacceptable. And the word mercy killing is actually just a euphemism because the plea of a gravely ill people more often than not is simply a cry for help and love. They don't really want to terminate their life, many of them anyway. But rather that's a way of expressing. If they want their life, if they say that I want to die now, that's more often than not, it's more of an expression for sympathy, more of an expression of a cry for help, more of an expression for a longing for love. Okay, so they need to be comforted. The next slide, please. There, the church does allow discontinuance of some medical procedure. We will explain this even further when we read the Catechism. Paragraph 2278. Discontinuing medical procedures that are burdensome, dangerous, extraordinary, or disproportionate to the expected outcome can be legitimate. You can refuse it, and it is the refusal of overzealous treatment. Here, one does not will to cause death, one's inability to impede it is merely accepted. So, for instance, you're uh, an aged person in his or her 80s. The doctor advised that since you have cancer, you need to go chemotherapy. The 80-year-old person can refuse that because it's really burdensome for an elderly of that age to have chemotherapy, all right? And any other circumstances where the procedure could be dangerous, you don't need to go through it. You don't need to uh, go through any experimental procedure even, all right? So whenever any of this procedure would be considered by a person, for instance, a one who who doesn't have who is simply living in social security, it can be very expensive to undergo certain medical procedure, and if it doesn't have any insurance, that that would drain everything that he or she has. So that would be very burdensome too. He or she can refuse any of these procedure, and that is not immoral. Okay? Paragraph 2279. However, even if death is thought imminent, all right, when you are dying, the ordinary care owed to a sick person cannot be legitimately interrupted. The use of painkillers to alleviate the sufferings of the dying, even at the risk of shortening their days, can be morally in conformity with human dignity if death is not willed. Okay? So as long as you don't use the painkiller to kill you, right? So you can't tell the doctor just overdose me with morphine. So I don't care if my life is terminated by the overdose of morphine. So that is not acceptable, of course, but only foreseen and tolerated as inevitable. Palliative care is special form of disinterested charity. As such, it should be encouraged. I know some are, laboring, having some struggle about taking a parent, for instance, who is dying to a hospice home care. Well, the reason for a hospice, and as a matter of fact, there are many Catholic hospices, is to make the dying process less painful and more dignified. because without any palliative care, it can be very uh, torturous, and that can even affect the physical form of the dying person. Okay? So, at all of in any case, even if you're already dying, the ordinary care of a person must never be interrupted. Okay, we will go into details in this particular issue later on. So let's go first for to the next slide. For the terminally ill, prolongation of life is not an obligation. If the person is already dying and he is terminally ill, and he is just or she is just being sustained by an artificial respirator without which he would be dead, you can remove the artificial respirator because that will merely be a prolongation of life. Okay. So if it is an incurable injury, disease, or illness, and normally you get the physicians to terminate to certify that the person is already in a terminal condition. So, and the life-sustaining procedure would only artificially prolong life. It may be interrupted. Okay, it may be withdrawn. So the litmus test here is the is the proposed treatment of the dying person would only serve to artificially prolong life? If the answer is yes, then whatever is being applied may be withdrawn. But never, as we mentioned in the previous slide, denial of nutrition or hydration, because nutrition or hydration is not a life sustaining, it is not a life sustaining treatment, but it is simply feeding and hydrating the patient. Okay? Unless, of course, apply having the IV or having the tube to feed the patient will cause more harm or burden to the patient. But other than that, you should continue to provide hydration and continue to feed even through the tube the patient because they are an ordinary care of a patient. Okay, let's go to the next slide and let's address the question of a person who is supposed to be in a vegetative state, or some of them are already in coma, or probably some are already brain dead. How does the church advise the care of people in this state? First, let's distinguish what is a vegetative state. Okay? In a vegetative state, patients are awake, but not aware of themselves or their environment. Okay? The condition is different from a coma. Let's distinguish it from a coma, in which the patient is neither awake nor aware. Both, however, are devoid of consciousness. Pope John Paul II specifically stated that the removal of feeding tubes from people in vegetative states is immoral and amounts to euthanasia by omission, causing death by starvation or dehydration. Providing food and water to such patients should be considered natural and ordinary care and not artificial intervention. And so here, we must understand the different degrees of vegetative state. If you are in a vegetative, firstly, we don't, even Pope John Paul II wouldn't want to use the word vegetative because they are still human beings. They never turn into vegetables, but the medical term for it is vegetative state. If it has been, if a patient has been in a vegetative state for over a month, is said to be, it is said to be a persistent vegetative state. If it is for over a year, it's called permanent vegetative state. Okay, but there are instances that people in a vegetative state would suddenly just wake up. The longest vegetative state on record is a person in a vegetative state for 42 years and then all of a sudden just woke up. So Pope John Paul II states very clearly that the removal of feeding tubes from people in vegetative states is immoral and that no judgment on their quality of life could justify such euthanasia by omission or death through starvation and dehydration. Since no one knows when a patient in a vegetative state might awaken, as I have mentioned, there are cases that people are in a vegetative state for so many years and suddenly just wake up. The evaluation of the probability founded on the scarce hope of recovery after the vegetative state has lasted for more than a year cannot ethically justify the abandonment of the interruption of minimal care for the patient, including food and water. Here we're talking about whether you should remove the feeding tubes, okay, of a person in a vegetative state. We have specifically the case of, I don't know if you still remember it, the case of Terry Schiavo in a highly publicized case in Tampa, Florida. I think that this happened around the early 2000, 2003, 2004. Uh, the husband of a severely brain damaged woman, the husband of Terry Schiavo, has battled her parents for years to have his wife's feeding tube removed so she can die. The only reason why she was alive is because of the feeding tube, according to the husband. So you should just uh, withdraw the feeding tube. Remember, she was just in a vegetative state. She was not brain dead. Neither was she in a coma. You'll see the difference. She was in a vegetative state. Okay. Now he removed. So he wanted the wife's feeding tube to be removed so she can die. He says he wouldn't have wanted to be kept alive with it. In his comments, John Paul II said families of such ill people needed more emotional and economic support so that they can better care for their loved ones. In no way does it justify withdrawing the feeding tube from a person in a vegetative state. Okay? What about the person in coma? What's the difference? As I mentioned a while ago, a person in coma is neither awake nor aware. Of course, she is or he is devoid of consciousness. Okay. But there's also a case, and there have been many cases too, when a person in coma suddenly woke up. One case is Terry Wallace, who spontaneously began speaking after 19 years, 19 years in coma. So again, you should not deny the ordinary care of feeding the patient in coma. especially if he's not dying, he's just in coma. There's no terminal disease. You can be in coma without terminal disease. Terry Schiavo did not have any terminal disease. Another question is, what about the brain dead person? Does brain death constitute actual death? Okay. You know what? It's really an open question. There is this case of Trenton McKinley. I think it's about 12 years old. He suffered 7 skull fractures and traumatic brain injury in an accident. Then they found no more brain waves, no more brain waves. And the doctors concluded, oh, he's brain dead. That is, he has suffered complete, irreversible loss of all brain function and therefore considered dead even if certain body functions continue, such as blood circulation, breathing, aided by machines. Okay. So the mother was asked to sign a paperwork so that they can already terminate the life and harvest the organs of this young boy. They are uh, tender and very healthy organs that they wanted to harvest. And the mother hesitatingly signed the paperwork for that to happen. Thank God there is under the law the so-called dead donor rule that before an organ can be donated, there must already be a certification that the person has died. And before the doctors were able to make a certification to that effect, Trenton McKinley started breathing and the brain activity started, just restarted. Okay. And and eventually Trenton McKinley completely recovered when it was already determined by the doctors as he was brain dead. So there is this question about uh, whether a brain dead person is actually a dead person. But many doctors also believe that brain death is not human death since the human tissue, the brain tissue can regenerate itself, especially if the person is of young age, like Trenton McKinley, or anyone. The doctors determine that if you're over 40, the brain tissue are still capable of regenerating itself. Okay, so a lot of neurologists uh, went into this study and uh, they determined that some patients would have a degree of what they call plasticity. Plasticity. I know this is a lot of medical terms. Plasticity means the ability to regenerate itself. Okay, so it's really an open question, but the, of course the church advises that we should err on the side of life rather than death. That must be a definitive separation of the spiritual soul from the material body. Temporary separation or near death experiences is not death. Okay? If he wakes up, if there was a temporary, just a temporary separation of the soul, then that near death experience yeah, uh, transpires, but that is really considered not an actual death. Okay. So these are things that are really controversial issues in our days, in our time. And we should be very careful not to terminate life just because people are in this particular situation or state. All right, so much for that. We go to the issue of suicide. What about suicide? Paragraph 2280 provides everyone is responsible for his life before God. You are a mere steward of your life. You do not own your life. Okay. So you are responsible for your life before God who has given your life. It is God who remains the sovereign master of life. We are obliged to accept life gratefully and preserve it for his honor and the salvation of our souls. We are mere stewards, not owners of the life God has entrusted to us. It is not ours to dispose of. Teaching of the church cannot be clearer than that. However, in paragraph 2283, we are being warned that we should not conclude that anyone who commits suicide would be deprived of life with God. So paragraph 2283 reads, we should not despair of the eternal salvation of persons who have taken their own lives. By ways known to him alone, to God alone, God can provide the opportunity for salutary repentance. So a person committing suicide in the process, even by mere split second probably, would be repenting of what he was doing. So the church prays for persons who have taken their own lives. So this is the reason why we are now, the church also gives full funeral services to persons who commit suicide, because the church cannot judge that the person, such person who committed suicide would not be going to heaven. Okay. I know some of the arguments about suicide is that it is not, we should not call it suicide really, especially when you are already terminally ill. That's why we have the right to die now, a right that's enshrined in many states like Oregon, even here in California, the right to die. This is not suicide, they say, because it's just stopping the dying process. There you go again, the euphemism. Not suicide, stopping the dying process. You have no right to terminate your own life. Okay? So there are, of course, many um, instances where, well, you doubt whether it's really suicide. For instance, if someone leaps from a tall skyscraper because because it's burning and the possibility of uh, rescue is considered uh, not no chance at all. If he jumps from the top floor of the skyscraper because he already felt the fire burning his skin, that's probably not suicide. That's rather more of a spontaneous reaction. So those people who uh, jump from the 9/11 from the what's that Trade Center tower during the 9/11 uh, incident, a lot of them jump from the top floor. They're probably not really committing suicide, but simply reacting to the pain of being burned. So we really do not know. And so we also have questions about soldiers who, in order to avoid his comrades from being killed, where a grenade was thrown towards them, and this soldier jumped into the grenade so that it could cover the other soldiers. So he was trying to defend them from being killed by the grenade that was thrown. that probably is more of a defense of others than suicide. So those are issues that we cannot really conclude whether it falls within the violation of this command. All right. Okay. So next slide. I think we have got to the end. And so we will be now